Tell me a little about yourselves, and how you got to be a fundraiser, and do you have a degree in fundraising?
Well, I can start. I'm Mary Arntz, and I am the Director of Annual Giving and Alum Relations here at Garrett Evangelical. And I do not have a degree in fundraising. I didn't even know fundraising was something that I could do until I worked my way into a fundraising position at a local nonprofit after my undergraduate degree. So I would say that I'm a fundraiser by happenstance, but I love it because it draws on a lot of the things that I enjoy doing and a lot of the skills that I have and have worked on developing. I love people, and I also love numbers and analysis and seeing how people and the gifts they can make provide what an institution or an organization needs to thrive.
I'm Joe Emick, Vice President for Development here at Garrett. I've been here about 15 months. My story is similar to Mary's. I fell into it and then fell in love with it as a vocation. So I was recruited to join my alma mater's development staff about 5 years after I graduated. Had the great blessing of some very good mentors and very good managers, and ended up on a career track that's led me to be a vice president now at 3 different institutions. And what drives my passion for it is similar to Mary's. It's a wonderful vocation and profession. And what I like most about being vice president is I serve the president's leadership team as well as overseeing the development office. And I have the unique opportunity to help think about overall institutional strategy as well as development strategy, and then figure out how those two things work together for the benefit of the institution.
All right. Mary, you went through the Master of Divinity program here at Garrett Evangelical. Can you reflect theologically for a moment on the work you do as a fundraiser? And do you ever think of it as a ministry?
Yes to both of those things. As I reflected on my work recently to draw out some of our theological tradition and attach it to what I do, I thought of a couple of things. The first thing that comes to mind immediately is the idea of invitation. And I think a lot of what we do as Christians is inviting people into God's goodness and God's grace. And I think that fundraising at its core and at its best is an invitation as well. And so we get to invite people to draw from God's goodness in their lives and share that with the community that they are part of, or the cause that they are part of. And so we'll talk later about how actually asking is very important. So as we think of that ask to support financially, viewing it as an invitation, I think is a connection point for connecting what fundraising is with our faith lives. And then the other thing that I think of is communion. And communion in the sense not necessarily of the table of the bread and the juice, but communion in the sense of, I think our faith has a lot of themes and traditions around interdependence. You look at our Trinity, our triune God, our God is interdependent, and so are we as people of faith. And so what we do when we are inviting people to give and when we give ourselves is reinforcing that sense of communion that our faith is built on. We can't do this work alone, whether we're in a church or a nonprofit. We are dependent on one another and interrelated by mixing up our money and our finances for a cause. And that's something we see in the very essence of the God that we worship. And as to ministry, I think, yes, what we do is ministry. A lot of the skills and training that we get exposed to in seminary around pastoral care comes in very handy when fundraising, because money and values, that's all related to our life experiences and the kinds of things that come up in pastoral care. So I do view what I do as ministry. It's not most people's first thought of what ministry looks like, but it very much can be.
What is fundraising really like? Can you tell a couple of your favorite fundraising stories and what you have learned from them? Can you share those with us?
As Mary said, fundraising is really an invitation. And I would encourage our students to read Henry Nouwen's Spirituality of Fundraising. He talks a lot about this and talks as eloquently as anyone I've read about this, that it is an invitation, and it's an invitation for people to join you in a vision and mission for the institution. So our first job really in that effort is to tell stories. And we're really storytellers. We're telling the story of the institution. We're actively listening to the donor stories. And then it's our job to figure out how to put those two stories together in a way that allows the donor to accomplish maybe something they've always wanted to accomplish for the benefit of the institution, but they've never had anyone invite them, or perhaps there's some technical issues around how they might make a gift and they've never had anyone to consult with them. And so, you can think of fundraising, there are a bunch of metaphors. So as Mary said, invitation, ministry, pastoral care. To be a little more crass, I tell people sometimes it's like being a bartender, because people tell you things that you would never imagine they would tell you in a business setting. And so in my mind, what it's really like is having the most privileged position in an institution, because as fundraisers, we're connected internally and externally, and we're the conduit for information and relationship building in between. At its best, it is incredibly fulfilling and rewarding because you're helping people. It does come with its challenges. It requires travel most often. It requires sometimes hearing things from people about the organization you may not want to hear, and you have to work through that. Many times people are making a gift to honor a late spouse or memorialize somebody important to them, and to the pastoral care point, you have to help them work through that before you get to the gift conversation. But I would say it's this really crazy and weird mix of challenges, emotionally challenging at times, but ultimately incredibly rewarding and fulfilling.
Finally, what are a few fundraising tips that you can give to our students that they can use in their ministry? Whether that be if they're going into a church or a nonprofit.
Mission first. Everything we do in philanthropy is about the mission. So before our students do anything else, make sure they are passionate. You have to be personally passionate about the mission. That's number one. Number two, be able to articulate that mission and tell the story of the mission. The next thing is to listen. The most important thing is to listen. Fundraisers who do all the talking are generally not very successful. And often, if we listen carefully, the donor will take themselves to where you want them to go. And it's almost as if it's sort of a collaborative ask. So those are the most important things on the front end. And then as the relationship develops, it's very important if the donor isn't quite getting where you want them to actually ask. There's a phrase in basketball, you miss all the shots you don't take. Well, in fundraising, you don't get all the gifts that you don't ask for. And so it's very important to sit across the table from the donor and ask directly, and not be afraid to ask for a specific amount, because often if you ask the donor, would you support our campaign, they have no idea where you need them or where you want them or how much a scholarship might require to fund. So those are the things that are top of mind for me. Passion for the mission, ability to articulate the mission, ability to listen, and then when the time is right, don't be afraid to make the ask or the invitation for somebody to join.
Do you want to add anything to that, Mary?
Sure. I think something encouraging to know is that giving trends across the country, there's a lot of research that reveals to us who is giving, what are they giving to, and it's pretty consistent over many years that individuals like you and me and Joe are giving the vast majority of funds to nonprofits across the country and even the world. So something like 70% of the charitable dollars that are given to organizations come from individuals. That's no foundations, no corporations. but everyday people. And so I think that's an encouragement to those of us who are in fundraising positions explicitly and those who are put in positions or find themselves in positions where fundraising is a part of your job, to have no fear. The people all around you already are the ones that are going to be most excited about the mission and able and willing to support.
Yeah, Mary makes an excellent point, because one of the challenges I think our students may find if they go on to have leadership positions in nonprofit organizations is often boards will gravitate toward corporations and foundations as the primary, that's where they think the primary source of funds are. And to Mary's point, individuals historically have made up the large percentage of donors. Although giving data for calendar year 2018 for philanthropy in the United States, we started to see some shifts in that a little bit. So individuals are still the overwhelming majority of sources of charitable gifts. But we saw a slight decrease, so that percentage in 2018 slightly below 70%, slight increase in corporations and foundations giving. I don't think that is a sign of a major shift that we're suddenly going away from individuals. But I think one of the practical pieces of advice I could give our students is as you go into situations, whether you're leading a church, whether you're leading a nonprofit, you probably will have some resistance from board members about having a strategy that is based on individuals first. And you have to make that case because the data, as Mary said, proves over decades that individuals are the greatest source of philanthropy. One of the things, though, that has changed in that regard over the last 10 years is we are seeing giving in the United States skewed very heavily toward the very wealthy. So when Mary and I first started in this work, if one were planning a capital campaign, you would assume that about 80% of your money would come from 20% of your donors. That ratio now is at minimum 90% of your money from 10% of your donors. And in a lot of cases, it's 95-5. We're seeing a trend now over the 10 years, a lot like the American economy. The bulk of the giving is with the highest net worth individuals. And so that also shifts some of the ways in which we think about strategy and where we're spending time, at least at the major gift level. And there's an opportunity at another time with more time, I think, to do a deep dive into those giving statistics, because we're seeing now some of the most complex set of giving data we've seen in a long time. The economy, the degree to which people are now supporting international endeavors, which we think is driven by the immigration concerns. The last 2 years, significant amount of philanthropy in response to natural disaster relief. And then we're just now starting to see the effects of the new tax laws having some impact on giving. So that makes it for me an exciting time, particularly for somebody new coming in, because it's the wild, wild west in philanthropy, the way I haven't seen it. The challenge is tried and true tactics are not as tried and true as they used to be. So it's becoming a much more complex philanthropic environment than we've seen in a long time.
So if there's a student who is thinking of going into a nonprofit, but more particularly a church, all of the data and all of the work you do as a professional fundraiser, that's quite complex. And you've talked about the importance of mission, of listening, and of asking. So what would you say to a student who's going into a church that really is declining in terms of its funds? How would you encourage them in terms of both theologically but also practically? Since they're not going to be professional fundraisers, how would you encourage them to keep at it, to know that this is possible, you know?
There are a couple of things that are top of mind to me. And first is go back to relationships. So particularly if it's a situation where it's a new appointment and you're coming into a situation where perhaps things are declining because the relationship with the previous pastor wasn't great, just take some time to listen. Talk to key people, key volunteers. If there are people who had been leadership donors and they haven't given in the last couple of years, or they've reduced their giving, just go have a conversation with them. And it may be that first conversation is not appropriate to touch that topic, but invite them out for coffee, take them to lunch, just start to build the relationship and build a little trust. And then you'll eventually and very quickly find out why there are declines. And I would say that one should not assume that they know why there is decline. I think Mary and I have both probably found ourselves in situations where we made a quick assumption about why a donor stopped giving and assume, oh my gosh, they're upset with us or whatever it is. And then you find out maybe they had an undisclosed health issue. Maybe they simply were traveling at the time they normally make their gift and they forgot. And so it's always important to have the conversation and get some real face-to-face information about it. And then how you respond depends on what you find out. And sometimes you cannot rehabilitate that donor. One of the fatal flaws fundraisers have is we are eternally optimistic and we always hold out. We can get them back or we can get this person to give. And sometimes the best decision we can make is to say, this just is not going to happen right now. I'm just gonna let it go and I'm gonna move on to working with people who are able to help us right now.
I think of a story of a donor that I knew in a previous organization, and he had been around the organization longer than anyone. He knew all of the history. It was a family connection for him. And I went to visit him in his law office, and I said, tell me, I was just getting to know him, starting to build that relationship. And most of what came out of his mouth was critique, concern and critical feedback about the organization. Over and over and over again. And here I was, I'd been there about, no more than a year probably. So I was still fairly new learning this organization. And I heard all of this feedback it felt very negative to me. And I had to just look at him and say, John, why in the world do you keep giving? Because you have this long list of things that you're concerned about at this organization. And he just stopped and he looked at me and he said, because I love it. And so I think there's this, I had assumed that because he had all of these critiques, he would not be interested, and in fact would decrease his giving over time, but he was doing the opposite. He was increasing his giving, and it was totally perplexing, but it's because he had this deep love, and I think that that was a really good reminder that loving an organization or a church comes with all of that critical feedback and engagement, and that's really important to hear. And that when we can receive that, our donors and our supporters and our church members feel listened to and valued, and that can actually counterintuitively reinforce giving. And so I think to lean into the difficult conversations, that's something that has proved helpful for me time and time again, and then you get these wonderful surprises. That's the story that came to mind as you were talking.
I would also say another important thing that fundraisers can do is have self-awareness about whether we are the right person to ask somebody for a gift. So one of the things I remind gift officers on the teams I've worked with before is our job is to make sure the relationship is developed and someone makes the ask. It doesn't necessarily have to be us. Often a peer volunteer is a much more powerful and effective solicitor. In our setting here in the seminary or in other nonprofits or in colleges and universities, at some level, people always know we're the paid staff. So Mary and I get paid to ask you for a gift. And at some level, you know that. But if one of your peers comes to you and says, my family and I have made a $100,000 gift to endow a scholarship, will you and your family join us in doing the same? That is a much more powerful message to you than knowing that I get paid to come and visit with you and tell you how great Garrett Evangelical is. And so that's the other thing that I would say, and this may be a little different in a church setting with a pastor, but in any other organization, figuring out who the right team players are. And it may not be you as the fundraiser who actually makes the ask.
Thank you both so much. Do you want to add anything else?
One thing that we did want to make sure to add is we are here for you, students, as you go out into your into your appointments and your nonprofit organizations. We we love fundraising, and we'd love to hear your questions or concerns, and hope that you see us as a resource. If you need someone to troubleshoot an issue with as you get started, we would love to help do that.
Reiterate Mary's invitation for students to come and see us
Yeah.
as a resource. And I would also say, having the ability to raise money will serve our students well in anything they do. Obviously, if one is pastor of a church, that's a key part of the responsibility. But it's also a wonderful job market right now across the board, especially in the Chicago area. So there's more need for good fundraisers than there are fundraisers. And right now, with the overall job market strong, it makes the nonprofit job market even more challenging for people trying to hire. So it is as I said earlier, it's a wonderful vocation, it's a wonderful profession, and especially for those who are staying here in the Chicago metro area, some amazing opportunities out there for people to pursue careers in philanthropy. So if there's anything Mary and I can do in that regard to help people discern that path for themselves, we'd be happy to do that as well.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
All right.